My name is Claire Donovan. I am 32 years old, and I live in Savannah, Georgia, in a small rented apartment overlooking the river. People in town know me as quiet, polite, maybe a little withdrawn, and that is fine by me. What they don't know, what they could never imagine, is that I carry within me a long history of silence, of being pushed to the margins by the very people who were supposed to call me family. It started years ago, long before I owned anything of value, back when I was still a girl standing in the shadow of my stepmother, Evelyn. She arrived in my father's life like a storm that never left. I was 12 when they married. By the time I was 16, she had already mastered the art of making me invisible. In our house, her smile ruled every conversation, her words guided every decision, and my father, tired, grieving, maybe just lonely, let it happen. So by the time I turned 32, I had learned the role I was expected to play at family gatherings. Sit quietly, nod politely, and accept the jokes at my expense. It was easier that way, or at least that's what I told myself. That evening, though, the night of my cousin's birthday party, something shifted. The house where the party was held wasn't just a house. It was a grand southern estate on Habersham Street, draped in ivy, with white columns and French doors that opened to a backyard where lanterns glowed against the twilight. Neighbors admired it for years, pointing out its elegance during evening walks. To everyone in that dining room, the house symbolized Evelyn's taste, Evelyn's wealth, Evelyn's control. What no one knew yet was that the papers had changed hands. I arrived dressed simply, in a navy dress I'd bought secondhand but pressed carefully that afternoon. I never wanted to stand out, blending in kept the peace. Inside, the chandelier poured gold light over the oak dining table. Silverware gleamed. Crystal glasses sparkled like captured stars. My relatives buzzed with stories, new cars, vacations to Florida, promotions at law firms. I sat near the end, my chair angled slightly away from the center, the way I always did. "Raise your glasses." Evelyn's voice rang out like a command. She stood tall at the head of the table, pearls catching the light. Her lipstick was perfect, her hair sculpted to a shine. She looked every inch the queen of her little kingdom, and she relished it. We raised our glasses. Conversations paused, awaiting her blessing, and then, as if rehearsed, she turned toward me. "My dear Claire," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of sweetness that makes your teeth ache. "Still here, I see, and still enjoying the fruits of everyone else's labor." The words floated over the table like perfume laced with poison. A few cousins chuckled into their napkins. Someone whispered. My chest tightened. "You know," she continued, tapping her glass with a manicured nail, "people like you have a name, parasites, living off others, giving nothing in return." The laughter grew bolder this time, fueled by the permission her cruelty granted. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to remind them of the nights I'd driven Aunt Maggie to the hospital, or the weekends I'd helped Uncle Rick fix his porch. But the words clung to my throat like stones. And then Evelyn delivered the final blow. She leaned forward, her perfume overwhelming, her eyes sharp. "You can't even afford the wine you're holding." For a moment, silence reigned. Then the room erupted in laughter, louder and harsher than before. My ears rang. I looked around for even one ally, one person who would say, "That's enough." But they all looked away. Even my mother's photograph hanging in the hallway seemed turned from me. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, but my hands were steady. I slipped my phone from my pocket, tapped out 3 simple words, and sent them. "Cancel everything now." The message left the screen with a faint whoosh, a sound no one else noticed. I set the phone face down on the table, lifted my glass, and took a sip. To the others, I must have looked defeated, small, silenced yet again. Evelyn smirked, pleased with herself. My cousins returned to their chatter. The room resumed its noisy rhythm. But inside me, a different silence grew, one not of shame, but of certainty. because I knew something they didn't. I knew whose name was written on the deed tucked away in my bag. I knew whose signature had finalized the contract 2 weeks ago. And I knew that, before this night ended, every person in that glittering dining room would see me differently. Sometimes silence is not surrender. Sometimes silence is a fuse. And that night, I had just lit the match. When Evelyn called me a parasite that night, it wasn't the first time those words had been used to define me. They were just sharper, dressed in the elegance of wine glasses and candlelight. The truth is, I had been living with that kind of branding since I was 12 years old, when she first entered our lives and began rewriting the rules of what it meant to belong in a family. Back then, my father was still alive. He was a good man, but worn down, by grief, by work, by the relentless quiet of a house that no longer carried my mother's laughter. When Evelyn arrived, she brought light at first, or at least that's what he wanted to believe. She was polished, charming, and she knew how to make him feel young again. For a while, I tried to convince myself she might be a blessing. But blessings don't come with conditions, and Evelyn always did. I remember the first Christmas after their wedding. The house smelled of pine and cinnamon, stockings hung neatly over the fireplace. My father handed me a small box wrapped in gold paper. My heart leapt. I thought it might be the necklace I had admired in the store window. But when I opened it, I found a second-hand book, its pages yellowed, the corners bent. Before I could even thank him, Evelyn placed her hand on his arm and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "We must be careful not to spoil her. She has to learn her place." Her place. Those 2 words built the walls of my adolescence. From then on, every achievement of mine seemed to shrink under her gaze. When I made the honor roll, she told the neighbors it was only because the teachers felt sorry for me. When I applied for scholarships, she reminded me daily that no school wanted a girl without family money. And when I stayed up late to help my father with his bookkeeping, she called it playing secretary, dismissing the hours of numbers and notes as if I were a child pretending with crayons. The hardest part wasn't Evelyn's voice. It was the silence of everyone else. My father rarely defended me, too tired to risk another argument. My aunts and uncles, though they loved to call themselves family, looked away when Evelyn's words cut too deep. And my cousins, sensing where the power tilted, joined in with their little jabs. So I learned to carry my pride quietly. I saved coins in jars, worked summer jobs no one bothered to ask me about, and studied business textbooks I borrowed from the library. I told myself that one day I would build something no one could dismiss. But even then, I didn't know how or when. Years later, after my father passed, Evelyn tightened her grip on everything he left behind. She kept the house, the accounts, even the furniture my mother once picked out with such care. When the lawyer explained the will, Evelyn's smile stretched like a curtain closing on a play. All I received was a handful of personal items, my mother's scarf, a box of photographs, and the old lamp that sat in my childhood bedroom. "Be grateful," Evelyn said as she handed me the box. "At least you have memories. That's more than money can buy. But memories don't pay rent. Memories don't silence hunger." I moved into a studio apartment on the edge of town, the kind where the paint peels and the pipes moan at night. I worked odd jobs, waiting tables, stocking shelves, sometimes cleaning offices after midnight. To the family, I disappeared. To the world, I was just another woman hustling to make ends meet. Yet beneath the exhaustion, a spark remained. Each paycheck, no matter how small, I tucked away a fraction. Every class I could afford at the community college, I took. I studied business law, property management, real estate contracts. I was tired of being told what belonged to me and what didn't. I wanted to learn the language of ownership. The turning point came almost by accident. I was 27, standing in line at the bank when I overheard a man discussing a foreclosure notice. The property was the very house Evelyn had guarded like a throne. Years of her lavish parties, her endless renovations had drained her accounts. She was months behind on payments. That night I went home and spread my notes across the floor. My hands shook as I searched through listings, loan terms, and savings accounts I had quietly built. For the first time, I realized I might have enough, not for everything, but for a chance. The process took years. There were setbacks, denials, nights I nearly gave up, but each no only sharpened my resolve. I worked double shifts, skipped meals, sold my car for a smaller one. I endured whispers of she'll never make it and she's just drifting. Evelyn herself once sneered at me in the grocery store parking lot, laughing when she saw me carrying discount groceries. "Still pretending you're independent, Claire?" she asked, sliding into her luxury SUV. "You'll always be a burden." I smiled that day, though my chest ached, because deep down I knew a truth she didn't. Burdens don't build. And I was building. By 32, the papers were signed. The house, her house, the family's house, the house that had been the stage for every humiliation was mine. The deed sat folded in my bag, its ink fresh, its weight heavier than any insult I had ever carried. So when Evelyn called me a parasite at that dinner table, she wasn't just echoing years of cruelty. She was standing on a trapdoor and she didn't even know it. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight back. I simply sent that text, 3 words that would summon the truth into the open. Cancel everything now. The catering staff would stop serving at her command. The manager she thought answered to her would walk in with papers. And the cousins who laughed at me would fall silent as they realized the ground beneath them had shifted. I sat at that table, surrounded by glittering glasses and mocking smiles, and for the first time in my life, I felt no need to explain myself. The fuse was lit, and I was ready to watch the fire spread. The message had already left my phone. 3 words, so small, so simple, that carried the weight of years of silence. Cancel everything now. For a moment, nothing happened. The chandelier still glittered, forks still clinked against porcelain plates, laughter still rippled down the table. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, satisfied with her performance, one hand resting on the stem of her glass as though she had just delivered the evening's highlight. My cousins went on about their vacations, my uncles about the stock market, and I sat there, my phone face down, my glass of wine untouched. Then the first crack appeared. A server walked in carrying a tray of hors d'oeuvres, only to pause halfway across the room. He glanced at his phone, frowned, and turned sharply toward the kitchen. The tray of neatly arranged bites vanished with him. At first, no one noticed. Then, when a guest waved for champagne, another server appeared, whispered something, and left again empty-handed. I caught Evelyn's eye across the table. Her brow furrowed slightly, just enough for me to see the faintest ripple of confusion. She masked it with another smile, but the mask didn't quite fit anymore. "Where's the champagne?" Aunt Maggie called out, her voice light, curious. "Perhaps they're busy in the kitchen," Evelyn replied smoothly, though her gaze darted toward the door. Moments later, the music stuttered. The soft jazz that had been floating through hidden speakers cut off mid-note, leaving a hollow silence in its place. Conversations stumbled, voices lowered, and for the first time that evening, people looked around as if the room itself had changed. I stayed silent. My hands were folded neatly in my lap, my posture calm. Inside, my heartbeat thudded like a drum. One by one, more cracks appeared. Plates half cleared sat abandoned on side tables. The lights in the hallway flickered once, twice, before steadying. Then the air conditioning shut down with a heavy sigh, leaving only the faint buzz of the chandelier above. "Evelyn," Uncle Rick muttered, "something's off with your staff tonight. They know better than this," she snapped, her voice sharper than she intended. "I'll handle it." She rose from her chair, her heels clicking across the hardwood floor. She disappeared into the kitchen, pearls glinting in the light, her back stiff with authority. I could imagine her voice, commanding, scolding, demanding answers from people who no longer answered to her. When she returned, her smile was gone. Her lips were pressed thin, her eyes cold. She sat back down, picked up her glass, and sipped as though nothing had changed. But I could see it in the way her hand trembled against the crystal stem. Around the table, whispers began to rise. Why isn't the food coming? Did the caterer leave? Maybe a power outage. The facade was crumbling, and the best part was that no one understood yet who had pulled the first brick. Then the doors at the end of the dining room opened, and Mr. Henderson walked in. He wasn't family. He wasn't a guest. He was the property manager, the man Evelyn had relied on for years to keep her estate pristine. His presence in the dining room during a party like this was as strange as a storm cloud inside a church. Conversations died instantly. Henderson carried a folder under his arm, his expression neutral but his eyes scanning the room with a quiet weight. He walked past the servers frozen at the doorway, past the guests craning their necks to see, and stopped near the head of the table, right behind Evelyn. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady, "but there are documents that require acknowledgement." Every eye turned to him. Evelyn stiffened, color rising in her cheeks. "This is highly inappropriate," she hissed. "Can't this wait until morning?" Henderson shook his head. "No, ma'am, the effective date is today. It cannot wait." He placed the folder on the table with deliberate care. Papers fanned out, stamped and signed, heavy with authority. My cousins leaned forward, whispering, trying to catch a glimpse. Evelyn's hand hovered above the folder but never touched it. "What is this?" Uncle Brent demanded. No one answered, not yet. I lifted my glass, finally taking a slow sip of wine. The taste was bitter, but it steadied me. Evelyn forced a laugh, brittle and sharp. "Some kind of clerical error, I'm sure. Henderson, we will discuss this later." But Henderson didn't move. His eyes flicked toward me just briefly before returning to the papers. The gesture was small, almost invisible, but it was enough. My pulse steadied. The fuse was burning, and soon the fire would be undeniable. The silence stretched until it broke under the weight of curiosity. My cousin Lily, always the bold one, asked the question everyone was thinking. "What do those papers say?" Evelyn shot her a glare sharp enough to cut glass. "Nothing that concerns you." But it did. It concerned everyone. Because soon every person in that glittering room would realize that the ground beneath their feet had shifted, that the woman they laughed at was no longer a parasite clinging to their feast, but the owner of the feast itself. I set my glass down and leaned back in my chair, letting the moment unfold. For years, I had carried their mockery in silence. Tonight, silence was my weapon. And it was working. The silence that followed Mr. Henderson's words pressed down heavier than the chandelier above us. The party, once a storm of chatter, clinking glasses and laughter, had stalled into a kind of suspended breath. Even the cicadas outside seemed to pause, their endless summer song cut short by something larger, more commanding. Evelyn's hand still hovered over the folder, her fingers trembling despite the pearls at her wrist. She tried to smile, but it flickered like a candle in the wind. "Documents," she said, her voice brittle. "Always documents. This is nothing but—" "A transfer of ownership," Henderson finished for her. His tone was polite, measured, but unyielding. He opened the folder, sliding one page forward so that the nearest guests could see. Bold letters stretched across the header, "Deed of Sale." Gasps rippled through the room. Chairs creaked as cousins leaned closer, uncles adjusted their glasses, aunts whispered into their hands. Evelyn's color drained, then flushed crimson. "This is absurd," she snapped. "This house has been mine for—" "No longer, ma'am," Henderson interrupted softly, though the firmness in his voice cut like a blade. "The sale was finalized 2 weeks ago. The current owner requested tonight as the effective date." Her head whipped toward him. "The current owner who?" It was then that Henderson's eyes flicked unmistakably toward me. A shiver ran down my spine, but I did not move. Not yet. The room erupted in questions. What does this mean? Who bought the house? Is this some kind of joke? Evelyn clutched the edge of the table, her knuckles white. This is preposterous. Some mistake. This property is not for sale. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of wood against hardwood startlingly loud. Dozens of eyes snapped to me at once, wide, searching, incredulous. My legs felt heavy, but I stood anyway, smoothing the navy dress against my sides. For years, that table had been my prison seat. Tonight, it was my witness stand. I walked slowly to the head of the table. My footsteps echoed in the sudden stillness. When I reached the folder, I didn't look at Evelyn. I didn't need to. I reached instead for the deed, lifted it from the table, and held it steady. My voice came out calm, quiet, but it carried. "This house," I said, "is mine." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water, shock waves spreading through every corner of the room. Aunt Maggie's fork clattered to her plate. Cousin Lily's mouth fell open. Uncle Rick muttered something under his breath, shaking his head. Evelyn, though, laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "Yours," she scoffed. "Claire, don't embarrass yourself. You can barely keep the lights on in that shabby apartment of yours. Everyone here knows that." Her words would have stung once. Tonight they meant nothing. I laid the deed flat on the table, pointing to the signature at the bottom. "Read it," I said simply. Whispers rose, then hushed again as my cousin Daniel leaned forward, squinting at the document. His lips moved as he traced the lines with his eyes. Then he looked up, pale, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's her name," he said. "Claire Donovan." The room tilted. A chorus of disbelief broke out. Questions tumbled over one another. How? When? Why? Evelyn's mouth opened, closed, opened again, but no sound came out this time. Her face was a storm of rage and fear, but the fury in her eyes no longer had power over me. I met her gaze at last, steady and unflinching. "You called me a parasite," I said. "Said I couldn't even afford the wine in my glass, but parasites don't buy houses. And tonight you're sitting in mine." A gasp swept through the room like wind through tall grass. Someone laughed nervously, then stopped. Others shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of the roles they had played. The smirks, the whispers, the complicit silence every time Evelyn cut me down. Evelyn slammed her hand on the table, rattling the silverware. "This is a trick," she hissed. "You've schemed, manipulated." "No," I interrupted, my voice low but firm. "I learned, I worked, I saved. While you wasted, I built. And now the ground beneath your feet belongs to me." The chandelier light caught the paper as I lifted it once more. It gleamed like a verdict. For the first time that night, no one laughed. No one whispered. They simply watched, the truth too heavy to deny. Evelyn sank back into her chair, her shoulders rigid, her face a mask that could no longer hide the cracks. I turned from her and looked at the room, at the family who had let her words define me for years. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "I'm not asking for apologies," I said. "I don't need them. What I want is simple, respect. And if you can't give that, then this house has no room for you." The words hung in the air, undeniable, unshakable. And in that moment, standing there with the deed in my hand, I realized something I had waited my whole life to feel. I was no longer small. I was no longer invisible. I was the owner. The air in the dining room had grown so thick it seemed hard to breathe. My declaration still lingered, 3 simple words: "This house is mine," and the truth lay open on the table for all to see. Yet even with the deed glinting beneath the chandelier, Evelyn was not a woman who surrendered easily. She straightened her back, pearls catching the light as she adjusted them with practiced elegance. Her lips curled into something between a sneer and a smile. "Well," she said, her voice sharper now, "it seems my poor stepdaughter has developed a flair for theatrics. You always did enjoy pretending, Claire. Pretending to be accomplished, pretending to be independent, and now," she tapped the deed with one manicured finger, "pretending to be the lady of this house." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved across the table, though no one laughed loudly this time. My relatives glanced at one another, uncertain, caught between the habit of siding with her and the undeniable ink of my signature staring back at them. "This is no pretense," I replied, my tone even. "The papers are real, and they bear my name. You can question me all you like, Evelyn, but you cannot rewrite the truth." She waved a dismissive hand, as though brushing away a speck of dust. "You've always had a talent for manipulation. I'm sure you've tricked some desperate banker into believing you're good for a loan. But tell me," her eyes gleamed cruelly, "how long before you fail, as you always do? How long before this house slips from your fingers the way everything else has?" Her words struck with precision, crafted to reopen old wounds. And for a moment, I could feel the weight of years pressing down again. The laughter of cousins, the silence of uncles, the subtle ways they had all conspired in my erasure. But then I looked around, really looked, and saw their faces now. Doubt, hesitation, even shame. It wasn't just me who had changed. The balance of power in this room had shifted. Uncle Rick leaned forward, squinting at the papers. "But Evelyn," he said, his voice hesitant, "the deed, it does look official." Evelyn's head snapped toward him, her glare sharp enough to cut. "You of all people should know better than to question me." He leaned back quickly, his chair creaking. The old habits of fear were still strong. But Cousin Lily, bold as always, broke the silence. "If it's real," she said, her eyes darting between us, "then Claire isn't pretending. She's the owner now." The room stirred, a few nods, a few mutters, Evelyn's face flushed with fury. "Don't be ridiculous," she hissed. "Claire couldn't possibly afford this. She's nothing without handouts. She's a parasite." I finished for her, my voice calm but firm. "That's the word you chose earlier. But tell me, Evelyn, what does it make you, sitting here in a house you no longer own, mocking the woman who does?" Gasps filled the room. My words cut through the heavy silence like a blade. Evelyn's face froze, her mouth opening and closing with no sound. For the first time, her weapon of choice, words, had failed her. But she wasn't done. Her voice returned, lower now, more dangerous. "Don't think this makes you better than us. You've embarrassed this family for years, showing up empty-handed, living in squalor, leeching off our goodwill. You think one piece of paper changes that?" I held her gaze. "No, what changes it is respect. And if you don't have it, you won't have a place here." The cousins shifted uncomfortably. My aunt dabbed at her forehead with a napkin. Even the servers lingered at the edges of the room, unsure whether to resume their duties or flee. Evelyn rose suddenly, her chair scraping hard against the floor. She gripped the back of it with one hand, her knuckles white. "Listen to me," she declared, her voice rising, trembling with fury. "She is no savior. She has always been a disappointment. If you side with her, you will regret it. Don't forget who carried this family for years, who hosted these dinners, who kept this house alive. Without me, none of you would be sitting here tonight." Her words rang through the hall, echoing against the high ceilings. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then, quietly, Aunt Maggie whispered, "But the house isn't yours anymore." It was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried. Heads turned, faces changed. The old silence, the one that always suffocated me, shifted direction, pressing now against Evelyn instead. Her eyes widened. "You ungrateful," she started, but her voice faltered. I stepped closer to the table, placing my hand gently on the deed as if to anchor the moment. "Evelyn, this isn't about gratitude. It isn't about power. It's about truth. You built your kingdom on pretense, and now the walls are falling. The sooner you accept it, the sooner you'll stop humiliating yourself." Her breath came fast, uneven. She looked around the table, seeking an ally, someone to rescue her, but no one met her eyes. The fortress she had relied on for so long was crumbling, stone by stone, silence by silence. And for the first time, I saw fear flicker behind her fury. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply sat back down, calm, composed, as though this had been inevitable all along. The deed lay between us like a mirror, reflecting the truth no amount of denial could erase. And Evelyn, my stepmother, my tormentor, the self-proclaimed queen of the family, was left standing, her crown invisible, her throne gone, her audience silent. But deep in her eyes, I saw something else too, a spark, a calculation. She wasn't finished. Not yet. And I knew, with a certainty that chilled me, that this night was only the beginning. Evelyn remained standing at the head of the table, her chest heaving as if she had just fought a war with words and lost. The pearls at her throat no longer shone with the same authority. They seemed heavy, like shackles pulling her down. Her eyes darted from face to face, searching for loyalty, for someone, anyone, to speak in her defense. But silence had become her enemy now, and silence was everywhere. I watched her carefully, not with triumph but with clarity. For years I had studied her ways, the smooth smile, the careful posture, the little manipulations that bent the family around her finger. But tonight those weapons were slipping, and the more she fought, the more the truth pressed forward. "Fine," she said finally, her voice trembling but laced with venom. "If you all want to believe her, go ahead, but remember who has kept this family afloat. Who paid for your children's birthdays, your holidays, your little crises. Without me, you would all be lost." She lifted her glass hand shaking and drained it in one swallow, but the words didn't land as they once did. The faces around her no longer showed gratitude or admiration, they showed doubt. It was Lily, my cousin, who broke the spell. "Aunt Evelyn," she said slowly, "didn't you tell me last month that the bank was pressuring you, that there were late notices?" The room stiffened. Evelyn froze. "I never said that." "Yes, you did," Lily pressed, her voice gaining strength. "We were in the garden. You said you might have to sell the car. You said the house was—" "Enough." Evelyn's shout rattled the glasses. Her mask slipped further, rage seeping through. But it was too late. The whisper had become a spark, and sparks travel fast. Uncle Brent leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "Now that you mention it, I remember seeing men from the bank here last fall. Something about overdue payments." "That was a misunderstanding," Evelyn snapped. "No." Henderson, the property manager, spoke calmly from his place near the doorway. "It was not a misunderstanding. The mortgage was months in arrears. Notices were sent. I delivered them myself." Gasps, murmurs, all eyes turned to Evelyn, whose face blanched, then flushed with fury. "You had no right to discuss my affairs," she spat. Henderson didn't flinch. "They are no longer your affairs, ma'am. The ownership is clear." The room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the rustle of napkins, the shifting of chairs as people adjusted under the weight of revelation. For years, Evelyn had draped herself in wealth, parading her parties, her jewels, her perfectly staged dinners as proof of superiority. And we had all believed her, or rather, we had wanted to. It was easier than asking questions. But the truth had been rotting beneath the surface all along, and now it spilled out in front of everyone. I didn't need to gloat. I didn't need to speak. I let the silence do the work, and the silence said everything. Aunt Maggie, her voice trembling, whispered, "So all this time it was built on debt." Evelyn slammed her glass down. "No, you don't understand. I was protecting us, protecting the family. Sometimes sacrifices are required. You think she pointed at me, her finger quivering. "You think Claire could ever shoulder what I carried?" I rose slowly, steadying myself with a hand on the back of my chair. My voice, when it came, was soft, but it carried through the hall. "You didn't carry us, Evelyn. You carried your pride, and it crushed everything else." Her face twisted, her mouth opening to unleash another volley, but Henderson cleared his throat, holding up another sheet from the folder. "If I may," he said, his voice formal, almost judicial. "This document lists outstanding balances that were settled during the transfer of ownership. Without Miss Donovan's intervention, the property would have been seized." All eyes turned to me. The weight of their stares was heavy but not cruel. For the first time, I wasn't invisible. Evelyn's voice cracked, desperation seeping through. "You see, she's not noble, she's opportunistic. She swooped in to humiliate me to take what's mine. I met her gaze steadily. You lost this house long before I claimed it. All I did was stop the bank from taking it. But let's be clear, Evelyn, this isn't about humiliation. It's about truth. And the truth has been waiting a long time to be heard. Her hand trembled against the back of her chair. I could see the storm raging inside her, the fury, the shame, the unwillingness to let go. But the more she fought, the more the room shifted. Uncle Rick, who had always been quick to laugh at Evelyn's jokes, spoke up, his tone almost weary. Claire, if what Henderson says is true, you saved the house. I nodded once. I did. A hush fell again, heavier this time, and then slowly heads turned. Away from Evelyn toward me, the queen had been unseated. Evelyn gripped the chair tighter, her knuckles bone-white, her breath shallow. You think this changes anything? She hissed. Blood is blood. This family will always choose me over you. But her words rang hollow, a desperate echo of a kingdom that no longer stood. The cousins avoided her gaze. The uncles stared at their plates. The aunts fidgeted with their napkins. And in their silence, Evelyn's empire crumbled. I let the moment stretch, not out of cruelty, but because it was needed. For years, the truth had been buried. Tonight it had surfaced, undeniable and irreversible. Finally, I spoke. Respect is not inherited, it is earned. And tonight you've shown us what you built yours on, fear and illusion. But illusions can't last forever. The words hung in the air like a verdict. And in the flickering light of the chandelier, Evelyn's mask shattered, piece by piece, until nothing remained but a woman cornered by her own lies. The dining room felt different now, though nothing had changed in its appearance. The chandelier still glowed. The silverware still gleamed. The scent of roasted lamb still lingered in the air. But the air itself, thick moments ago with Evelyn's authority, had shifted. It was no longer hers. It was mine. Evelyn stood rigid at the head of the table, the pearls at her throat gleaming like shackles. Her eyes darted, desperate, from face to face, but no one came to her rescue. The silence that once silenced me had turned against her. I remained standing, the deed still resting under my hand. Henderson, steady and calm, had said all that needed saying. Lily had voiced the doubt. Brent and Maggie had filled in the missing pieces. The empire Evelyn built on illusions had collapsed not with a scream, but with whispers and nods. And now it was time to finish it. I lifted the deed from the table and held it up. The paper caught the chandelier's light, shimmering like proof carved in stone. This house, I said, my voice clear and calm, is mine, legally, fully, tonight and for every day that follows. A ripple of gasps spread, but I did not flinch. My voice grew steadier, not louder, but firmer, like a river cutting through stone. You've called me many names over the years. Burden, drifter, parasite, and every time I swallowed those words in silence. But tonight I am done swallowing. My gaze swept the table. I worked, I saved, I built, alone, and now you are sitting in a house that belongs to me. The words landed with a weight that no laughter could dismiss. My cousins looked down at their plates. My uncles shifted in their seats. My aunts avoided my eyes. The servants in the doorway glanced at each other, as if silently acknowledging what they had always suspected, that the queen of this household was not invincible. Evelyn's voice broke through, shrill and cracked. You think owning a house makes you powerful. You think this changes who you are. You're still nothing. You're still the little girl no one wanted. The cruelty of her words stung, but not the way they once would have. They no longer defined me. They revealed her. I stepped closer, placing the deed flat on the polished oak again, the sound echoing like a gavel. You're right about one thing, Evelyn. Owning a house doesn't make someone powerful, but it does reveal the truth. And tonight, the truth is simple. You don't get to define me anymore. The room held its breath. I turned my eyes to the family who had sat silent for so long. Respect, I said, is not something you inherit by blood or steal by force or buy with borrowed money. Respect is earned, and tonight I claim mine." Aunt Maggie nodded almost imperceptibly, but it was enough. The first crack in their loyalty to Evelyn had become a fissure. Uncle Rick cleared his throat. "Well," he muttered, glancing at Evelyn, she does have the deed." It wasn't a full admission, but it was a surrender. Evelyn's face contorted. "You cowards," she spat. "All of you, you would turn against me so quickly." Her fury rang hollow. It wasn't command anymore, it was desperation. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I simply stood taller, letting the silence reinforce what words could not. Finally, I spoke, softly but firmly. "This house has room for those who respect it and those who respect me. If you cannot do that, the door is right there." Gasps again. A bold line drawn, one that none of them had ever imagined hearing from me. Evelyn slammed her palm against the table, rattling the silverware. "You can't do this," she shouted. But Henderson's calm voice answered before I could. "She can, and she has every right to." The silence that followed was different from the silences of my childhood. It was not suffocating. It was liberating. One by one, eyes turned toward me, not with contempt, not with pity, but with something closer to recognition. For the first time, they saw me not as a shadow, not as a burden, but as someone who had claimed her place. And as I stood there, steady in the glow of the chandelier, I realized the truth Evelyn could never accept. The power she had wielded for so long had never really been hers. It had been borrowed from silence, from fear, from the family's unwillingness to see. Tonight, that power was gone. Tonight, the table had turned. The dining room was no longer a place for celebration. It had become a courtroom, the polished oak table its bench, the chandelier its gavel. And Evelyn, the woman who had ruled this house with an iron smile, was suddenly the defendant, her empire crumbling around her. She still stood tall, back straight, chin raised. But the cracks were showing. Her hands trembled when she reached for her glass. Her eyes darted with a wildness I had never seen before. She was fighting not only for control, but for survival. "You all think she's some savior," Evelyn said, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. "But you don't know the truth. Claire has always been ungrateful, always resentful. She waited like a vulture for this moment. Do you think she really bought this house for the family? No, she bought it to humiliate me, to tear this family apart." Her words echoed, desperate and sharp. A few cousins exchanged uncertain glances. Old habits die hard. Evelyn had always been persuasive. But tonight, the ground was shifting beneath her and she couldn't find footing. Henderson, still by the doorway, cleared his throat. He held up another paper from his folder. "If I may," he said, his tone crisp, professional. "This document outlines the debts attached to the property prior to sale. Significant arrears. It was not a question of if foreclosure would happen, but when." He laid the paper on the table. The numbers spoke louder than words. Overdue payments, penalty fees, interest compounding like weeds in a garden left untended. Evelyn's face blanched. "You had no right." "On the contrary," Henderson interrupted politely. "It is public record. Anyone could have found it." The room stirred. Murmurs swelled, cousins whispering, uncles shifting uncomfortably in their seats. Aunt Maggie's voice trembled as she spoke. "Evelyn, you told us the house was paid off years ago." Evelyn slammed her hand on the table, rattling silverware. "And so it was, but circumstances change. Do you think any of you understand what it costs to keep a home like this alive? The staff, the maintenance, the events, I carried it all for you. For us." Cousin Lily's voice rang clear. "Or for yourself, because it sure seems like it was your parties, your dresses, your pride." The words cut deeper than mine ever could. Evelyn's mask slipped another inch. I remained silent, my hand resting lightly on the deed, the paper like an anchor beneath my fingers. Silence was no longer my prison. Tonight, it was my weapon. Uncle Brent, who had spent years singing Evelyn's praises, finally spoke. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice low, almost pleading. "All these years were you in debt?" Evelyn's eyes flashed. "I did what I had to do," she snapped. "For appearances, for dignity. Do you think society respects a family that looks poor? I protected us from shame." "No," I said softly, the first word I had spoken in minutes. All heads turned toward me. My voice was calm, steady. "You didn't protect us from shame, Evelyn. You buried us in it. You used appearances as a shield while the truth rotted underneath." Her face twisted, fury boiling over. "You dare lecture me, you who contributed nothing." I lifted the deed once more, the paper firm in my hands. "I contributed the one thing you never could, responsibility. I didn't spend what I didn't have. I didn't build illusions. I built reality. And reality is written here." The chandelier light glinted off the ink of my name. Evelyn's breath came fast and shallow. She looked around the room, desperate for someone, anyone, to rescue her. But the silence of the family told her everything. Their loyalty had cracked. Their belief in her had shattered. Then Aunt Maggie, timid no longer, whispered the words that ended the trial. "You lied to us." The sentence spread like fire. Faces hardened. Murmurs grew louder. The cousins who once mocked me now stared at Evelyn with disbelief. The uncles who laughed at her jokes now frowned, shifting in discomfort. Even the servants in the corner exchanged glances, their eyes wide with the confirmation of what they had long suspected. "You lied," Lily repeated, stronger this time. "Over and over. You made us feel superior when really you were drowning, and you dragged us with you." Evelyn staggered back a step, her hand clutching the back of her chair. Her mask, the careful smile, the polished confidence was gone. What remained was raw, desperate, unmasked fear. For years she had called me invisible. Tonight she was the one they refused to see. I stepped forward, my voice steady, final. "The truth is out now, no more illusions, no more fear. This house will no longer be a stage for lies. It will be what it should have always been, a home." The words landed, firm and undeniable. Evelyn's lips parted as if to strike again, but no sound came. She looked around one last time, her gaze searching for an ally, but none came. The family's silence, once her greatest ally, had turned its back on her. And in that silence, her mask fell away completely. The silence that followed Aunt Maggie's whisper, "You lied to us," was heavier than any accusation. It settled over the dining room like a thick blanket, pressing against every wall, every glass, every heart. For years, Evelyn had commanded silence to her advantage. Tonight, it betrayed her. She stood there, rigid, lips trembling as though words might still save her. But the family's eyes no longer held the familiar glaze of loyalty. They held suspicion. They held betrayal, and in some, even contempt. I remained standing at the far end of the table, the deed resting before me like a gavel waiting to fall. For 32 years I had lived at the edges of their gatherings, a shadow cast in the glow of Evelyn's performance. But now all eyes were on me. I breathed deeply, steadying the tremor that threatened my voice. "You've heard the truth," I said, calm but firm. "The debts, the illusions, the lies, and still Evelyn insists this house is hers. But look around you, what remains of her rule? Nothing but fear and shame." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Don't listen to her. She's poisoning you, turning you against your own family." "No," I replied, my tone unyielding. "I am offering this family something you never gave, a choice." Gasps, murmurs, Evelyn stiffened. I continued. "This house is mine now, but it will not be a stage for cruelty or deception. It will be a place of respect. And here, respect is the only price of admission." The words echoed in the vaulted room. My cousins glanced at each other, uncertain but listening. My aunts leaned forward, their faces pale but intent. Even the servers froze as though afraid to disturb the air. "If you cannot treat me with respect," I said, my gaze sweeping the table, "then this house is not for you. The door is open. Are free to leave." It was not a shout, it was not a plea, it was a verdict. The room erupted. Uncle Brent muttered about tradition, about bloodlines. Cousin Daniel whispered furiously to Lily. Aunt Maggie dabbed at her eyes, murmuring something about truth and shame. Evelyn, furious, slammed her fist against the table so hard that the crystal glasses jumped. "You dare throw family out of their own home," she spat. "This house is mine," I repeated. "Legally and morally. Blood does not excuse cruelty. If you want to stay, you stay with respect. If not, you leave." The chandelier light caught her face as she leaned forward, eyes blazing. "You wouldn't dare." I held her gaze. "Try me." A hush. The challenge hung in the air, sharp and dangerous. For years she had struck me with words, and I had absorbed every blow. Tonight the shield was gone. Tonight I stood unflinching. Lily, her voice shaky but clear, broke the silence. "She's right. Respect is all she's asking for. That's not too much." Evelyn whipped her head toward her. "You ungrateful child." "No," Lily said, louder this time. "I'm tired of pretending. You treated Claire like dirt and we all went along with it. Look where it got us, buried in lies." The words cracked the air like lightning. For the first time, someone other than me stood against Evelyn openly, and once the first stood, others followed. Uncle Rick sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. Maybe she's right. We were blind." Aunt Maggie nodded, tears brimming. "We let it happen. We let her carry the shame alone." One by one, heads turned away from Evelyn. She saw it. She felt it. Her face twisted with rage, but behind it was something rawer, fear. "This is betrayal," she hissed, her voice trembling. "All of you betraying me for her after everything I've done." I stepped closer, my hand resting on the deed. My voice softened, but it carried more power than any shout. "No, Evelyn, this isn't betrayal. This is accountability, something you've never faced, until tonight." Her eyes burned, but her words faltered. For the first time, she had no script, no performance to hide behind. I turned back to the family. "I will not beg for your approval. I will not fight for scraps of affection. The rules are simple now. Stay if you can respect me. Leave if you cannot, but know this, tonight marks the end of silence." The verdict was delivered. The room held its breath. Some bowed their heads. Some shifted uneasily. But none spoke against me. Even Evelyn stood speechless, her authority shattered. And in that stillness, I knew the tide had turned. The chandelier still shone, but the glow felt colder now, like moonlight spilling over a battlefield after the fight had ended. Plates of untouched lamb cooled on the table. Wine glasses stood half full, the ruby liquid trembling in the light. And the people who had once laughed at Evelyn's jokes sat mute, their gazes lowered, as though they had all been caught in the middle of some great unmasking. I did not speak. I let the silence settle, let it creep into the corners of the room and press against every chest. It was not the suffocating silence I had grown up with, the silence that forced me into shadows. No, this silence was mine. It was a mirror, and in it they were all forced to see themselves. Cousin Lily was the first to break. She looked across the table, her hands trembling around her napkin. "Claire," she said softly, I'm sorry. For laughing at you all those years. For not saying anything tonight until it was safe. You didn't deserve that." Her words hung in the air, fragile but true. For a moment, no one else dared to breathe. Then Uncle Rick cleared his throat. His eyes, usually quick with mischief, were clouded with something heavier. I suppose we all should have said something, but we didn't. We chose comfort over truth." Aunt Maggie dabbed at her eyes, her voice breaking. "You carried the weight of her cruelty alone, and we let you. Their confessions were not loud. They were not grand, but they were enough." I looked at them, my chest tight, not with anger, but with something far more complicated. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, of hearing them admit their silence, of watching them squirm beneath the truth. And yet, standing here now, I felt no triumph, only clarity. "You were silent," I said, my voice low but steady. "And silence can wound as deeply as words. But tonight, silence has changed. Tonight, it speaks for me." The words lingered, and in them a shift occurred. No one challenged me. No one defended Evelyn. Even those who still squirmed in their chairs knew the truth had found its place and it would not be moved again. Evelyn sat stiffly at the head of the table, her jaw clenched, her face pale. Her eyes flicked from one relative to the next, searching desperately for a shred of loyalty. But none came. Her reign had ended not with a coup, but with abandonment. She slammed her glass onto the table, the crack of crystal sharp in the heavy air. "You're all cowards," she hissed, turning on me for her, after everything I did for this family. But her words no longer carried the weight they once had. They sounded hollow, brittle, like a door slamming in an empty house. The family looked at me now, not with fear, not with mockery, but with something new, recognition. I drew a breath, steady and slow. "I don't ask for apologies," I said. "What I ask is simple, respect, and not just for me, for each other. This house will not be a place for cruelty anymore. If you cannot honor that, then you do not belong here." No one argued, no one laughed. Instead, chairs shifted as people nodded quietly, the weight of my words sinking into them. Some avoided my eyes, ashamed. Others met them, a glimmer of understanding there. And I knew, in that moment, that the tide had turned for good. The silence that had once kept me small had become the silence that lifted me. It was no longer a cage. It was a crown. I let it linger, not rushing to fill it. For once, the power of stillness was mine to command. And as I looked around the table, at the downcast eyes, the clenched hands, the uneasy shoulders, I realized something profound. Respect was not always given freely. Sometimes it had to be claimed, and tonight I had claimed it. Evelyn sat frozen, her pearls gleaming, her fury simmering, but she was no longer the center of the room. I was, and nothing she could say would change that. The guests left one by one, quietly. No more laughter, no more clinking glasses, only the hush of shoes on marble, the soft click of the front door closing again and again. No one dared say goodbye to Evelyn. She remained seated at the head of the table, still wrapped in her bitterness like a woman clinging to an empire that had already collapsed. I didn't ask her to leave. I didn't need to. The silence around her was louder than any eviction notice. Eventually, even she stood. Her heels clicked against the floor with sharp defiance, but no one followed her. And as she passed me by, she didn't meet my eyes. For the first time in her life, she had nothing left to say. And that was the final victory. When the door finally closed behind her, the room exhaled. I was alone. I walked through the house slowly, room by room. I ran my hand along the railings I once wasn't allowed to touch, passed by the hall closet where I used to hide during family dinners. I paused at the fireplace where Evelyn had once hung portraits of only her real children. It was bare now, but I wasn't angry, not anymore. Something had shifted in me tonight. I thought revenge would feel sharp, triumphant, but it didn't. What it brought was peace, a quiet, undeniable peace, not because I'd humiliated Evelyn, but because I'd reclaimed something I thought I'd lost forever, my voice. This house, it had once been a stage for pain, for power games, for whispered insults and cold shoulders. But from this moment forward, it would be different, not perfect, just honest. I wasn't the leech anymore. I never had been. I was the root beneath the ground, silent, steady, unseen, but growing all the while. And tonight, I'd finally broken through the surface. It wasn't about the deed. It wasn't even about Evelyn. It was about knowing my worth and refusing to apologize for it. As I stood beneath the chandelier, its light catching on the edges of the now empty glasses, I smiled. Not a smug smile. A real one, gentle, quiet, certain I had not inherited this house. I had not taken it by force. I had earned it, through the years of being invisible, through the silence I endured, through the courage it took to speak. And now it was mine, not just in paperwork, but in purpose. I would fill it with people who saw each other, who listened, who cared. I would build a new kind of legacy, not with grandeur or pearls, but with truth. Because sometimes the loudest redemption comes not from shouting your name, but from no longer needing anyone else to say it. Thank you for watching this story. If it touched your heart, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need it today. Wishing you and your loved ones peace, health, and a home filled with real warmth. Take care, and remember, you are never small when you know who you are.